I'm here at the site of Mission San Rafael Arcangel, and what you see behind me is the modern Church of St. Rafael and its associated school. But almost nothing from the original mission remains. In fact, it has been called the most obliterated of California's missions. So what we're going to do today is use historic documents to try to figure out what the extent of this mission used to be and what life was like at it, and also see how much has changed to create the modern town of San Rafael. So let's go check it out. Mission San Rafael Arcangel was founded in 1817 as a medical assistencia for Mission San Francisco de Asís, located about 15 miles away in the middle of San Francisco. Assistencias were extensions of larger missions, sort of like how a satellite campus works in the university system today. As disease was rampant in indigenous populations following contact with Europeans, the San Francisco mission was filled with sick native people. So Mission San Rafael was built as a hospital to take care of the sick, and it was positioned in the North Bay because of the San Francisco Bay's microclimates. On any given day, it can be cold and foggy in San Francisco, but warm and sunny in San Rafael. Back then, it was thought that warm, dry climates could make you better. Mission San Rafael also served a political purpose. In 1812, Russia established its southernmost presence in North America at Fort Ross in present-day Sonoma County, and threatened Spain's claim to Northern California. Mission San Rafael acted as a check against Russian expansion, and until the creation of Mission San Francisco Solano in Sonoma in 1823, it was the northernmost mission in California. The first mission buildings were simple adobe structures, and in a few years it grew, and by 1822, it was granted full mission status. There were 386 people at the mission in 1818, but by 1825 the mission's population reached 1,008. So 200 years ago there lived about 1,000 people right in the area in front of us now. One of the most famous people to have lived at the mission was Chief Marin, who Marin County is named after. He held authority as an alcalde, or an overseer, at Mission San Rafael, but later in the 1820s rebelled against the mission and hid out on the tiny Marin Islands, which are also named after him. He was captured and imprisoned in the San Francisco Presidio before coming back to Mission San Rafael, where he lived until his death in 1839. Chief Marin's story highlights the complexity of the mission system and shows that indigenous people weren't passive during Christianization. Mission San Rafael was the first mission to be secularized, effectively closing in 1834. By 1840, the population had fallen to under 100 people. The mission turned to ruin. It was briefly a headquarters for John C. Fremont during the Bear Flag Revolt, and it was here that Kit Carson was dispatched to kill several unarmed Californios to keep the revolt a secret. Several churches have existed since the original mission decayed in the mid-1800s, and the ones before us date to the 20th century. So what can we do to get an idea of the mission's original extent and to see how things have changed? Fortunately, two maps from the mid-1800s help us tell the tale. The first map, drawn by George Black in 1854, shows a close-up of the original mission buildings. We know that the current St. Rafael Church occupies the site of the original mission, so using that as an anchor we can measure away from the mission to figure out how far the original mission extended and what it looks like today. The scale of the map is in links, which is an old unit of measurement equivalent to 7.92 inches. So using this scale, the closest buildings to the mission are approximately 200 links north and 300 links northeast of the mission center, or about 130 to 200 feet away. That places the buildings about right here on Mission Street, and research by DeBaker suggests that at least one of them was a home for neophytes, which was a term meaning a baptized indigenous person. To the south and east of the mission is a large plot of land labeled as the Vineyard. This area would have been where the mission's vineyard and gardens were. And so there would have been all sorts of grapes going all throughout this area, as well as plenty of crops. Things like beans and corn, as well as wheat, were all grown in fields that are now covered by this business district. And when you think about the mission of the mission, in addition to, Christianizing the populace, was to be these self-sustainable units that could just provide for themselves. And so, of course, there would have been extensive gardens and farms to feed the many people that were at the mission. The other takeaway from this area here is that, if we had vineyards here in the late 18-teens, that's well before any of the vineyards at Napa. So take that, Napa, Marin's got you beat. You know, we got church wine coming in for the victory, as perhaps the earliest wine in Northern California was grown right here. So we're at Boyd Memorial Park, and the park itself is pretty old. It was opened in 1905. If you've ever been here, you'll know that there's this slab-lined stream that kind of cuts through the entire park, and where it exits the park is very close to the grounds of the original San Rafael mission. So I found one source that states that the top of this stream is referred to as the Old Mission Spring. And so that seems to clearly implicate the mission and this as a source of water. And it makes sense. We know that there was an aqueduct at the mission, which means that they had to have had a source of water that was topographically higher than the mission itself. And Boyd Park happens to be on a slope, and we are right now, especially as we get up to the top of this stream, an area that could have provided the necessary kind of elevation difference for there to be a functioning aqueduct at the mission. So I'm pretty sure, although there's not a lot of strong evidence you know, in the historical record, that this is where a lot of the water would have come for you know, drinking water and cleaning water and everything at the mission grounds.
The second historic map of the mission is called the 1854 Murphy map, and it shows an even greater area. The scale on this map is in varas, which is an obsolete Spanish unit of measurement equivalent to 2.74 feet. So like we did before, we can use the scale to see how the mission fits onto today's landscape. The first thing that popped out to me is that the land south of the vineyard is labeled as tierra baldia, which means wasteland. I was confused because today it's home to nice buildings and businesses, so I checked another old map of San Rafael, and sure enough, about a quarter of the town was once a marshland. The coast would have come up to about 2nd Street and have covered Albert Park and the business district along the 580 and marshy water. The only thing built on the marshes in the 1800s was the railroad. It wasn't until the 20th century that the marsh was filled in and built over. This explains some of the weird roads in San Rafael, like the strange curve in 2nd Street near Trader Joe's.
So right behind me is San Rafael Creek, and today it's pretty diminished. You know, it's been paved over in a lot of places and really altered. But about 200 years ago, this was the only way for you to get through that tierra baldia that I talked about. You know, this marshland, this is the only clear spot. And it was mentioned on the map that this was the embarcadero, or the place where Spanish ships carrying the friars from the mission in San Francisco would come up through the marshlands, through the channel of San Rafael Creek, and that's where they'd get off here to go to the mission. A lot has changed, but we still do have, you know, a creek that is still here. So we're right in front of the mission now, and in this area would have been where the mission cemetery was. We know that it's right in front of the mission and slightly to the side. And it would have been pretty large. We don't know exactly how large or how many people are buried here, but what we do know is that it was in use for several decades, and that there were many people who once lived at this mission. So you put that together, I'd estimate at least several hundred people were buried right in this spot. We know later that in the 1880s, specifically in 1884, the marked graves from the mission cemetery were moved, and they were put into Mount Olivet Cemetery on the other side of town. What this means, though, is that notice that only the marked graves were moved. A newspaper article from 1885 says that those of the Indian lay where they were. And I take that to mean that the marked graves were those perhaps of the Padres, people who had, you know, tombstones and relatively nice burials, whereas those of the indigenous people who lived and worked at the mission probably received unmarked graves. And by the 1880s, when the town was expanding, no one really knew exactly where those were anymore. And so what you probably have is decades of buildup. We have, the road right in front of me. There's a large building behind me that probably still cover the graves of many people who lived and worked at Mission San Rafael, including, most likely, and I don't have any evidence to this, but we do know that Chief Marin did die in 1839 at Mission San Rafael, and so he's probably buried here too. And to me, it doesn't seem very fitting that the final resting place of the namesake of the entire county is somewhere unmarked right here, most likely. But in any case, this is where the Mission Cemetery was.
So although almost nothing from Mission San Rafael Arcangel remains, Its story involves holding back the Russians in a sort of 19th century Cold War, making the region's first wine, and the likes of important people like Chief Marin and Kit Carson. It also shows just how much has changed in 200 years at San Rafael. Thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe to Poopy Archaeology to learn more about the past.
Moop Up, can you tell us about San Rafael?
Yeah, just say that.